Okay, alrighty, gang. Howdy. This video is going to be talking about the reading by Charles Hill called The Psychology of Rhetorical Images. And I just created some notes, which will be posted right next to the reading in the video. This is the reading that we're doing following a couple of readings by Kenneth Burke on Terministic Screen and Literature's Equipment for Living, and this is in the module on Rhetoric as Symbolic Action and Identification. So we only spent a little bit of time on Burke, but after Burke, one of the big things that happened in our field was this discussion of the kind of persuasive power of visuals, of images, of this sort of new world of like advertisements everywhere and films. This is coming out in 2004. This you can see the citation at the bottom there. Right when I took the job here at UNLV, 2004, 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. This book came across my desk somehow, and it was a really interesting volume at the moment because at that time, rhetoric was exploding with discussion over images, visuals. A couple of years before my job at UNLV, back in Illinois where I was getting my PhD, the department hired a young hotshot scholar from Northwestern named Kara Finnegan. She was still in grad school and she was finishing up her dissertation, and she came to interview in our department, and she was giving a research talk on the rhetoric of visuals. And this was like groundbreaking stuff at the time. And it was even a little controversial, but it was mostly like exciting and kind of sexy. It seems crazy now to think about it, but like again, think about 2004 was just like the early phases of smartphone came out 3 years later. So the internet was there, computer terminal screens were happening, and that was part of the push to be thinking about images. But I think mostly it was about television, it was about magazines, it was about billboards, on the side of the road, it was about films, music videos, and that kind of stuff, right? So culture was like very visual. Pop culture was very visual, and rhetoric scholars were starting to more and more take it seriously as a form of rhetoric. But what you see happening in this chapter, and this is by Charles Hill, who's actually one of the editors of the book that put these chapters together, and he's a good scholar of rhetoric in a more slightly traditional vein. And so we are coming out of a module on rhetoric as argumentation, and as we've discussed in class, the middle part of the 20th century in terms of rhetoric was still largely driven by an interest in logic and argumentation and rational persuasive reasoning, right? And so it took some time to kind of move away from that and start thinking more broadly. And again, Kenneth Burke was pushing this effort to think more broadly about symbols and about kind of like everyday stuff and aesthetics and literature and on and on. And so this book, as far as I know, is one of the first major collections to be trying to thinking about rhetoric and as visuality and as images. And what I think is interesting about this is the author is trying to come at this from a like what is going on in the brain, like psychologically, how do images work, how do they appeal. So that part's kind of cool, but it's also interesting that in order to explain this stuff, he's reaching back to the work of Chaim Perelman. And even before that, he doesn't mention George Campbell. When he gets into this business of vividness, this goes back to the 18th century. This is like not new stuff. And so here's someone who's trying to push into this new space of thinking about images rhetorically, but drawing on kind of existing concepts and terms to try to do that work, right? And I think it works pretty well, and he makes the case fairly well. But obviously 20 years later, plus we are in a different kind of world of images. And, we'll get there in a few more modules where we look at rhetoric as virtuality. For here, we're just kind of looking at this more as a kind of historical moment. Again, this is 20 years ago, but it feels much older. And I think there's some good things to be learned here about images and how they work rhetorically. But also, again, there's sort of a limitation because this is before the smartphone. This is before customized news feeds and, the whole disinformation business and virality and all that kind of stuff. It's right before all that kind of stuff kicks in. In any case, let's dive in and look at the main ideas. It's not a super long article. Oftentimes academic articles are about twice as long, especially for a book chapter. It's a little bit on the shorter side. Nevertheless, there's some stuff in here that we don't need to get too worried about. So just focusing on the stuff that's in this these notes here, these reading notes, is your best bet. I've just tried to condense it all down to the key stuff. So let's see. First off, we've talked about the psychological perspective. He says, you can also look at images from like a cultural vantage and like, how images work in terms of culture, and that gets us into like values and rituals and communities and subcultures and so on. And that's all awesome, but he's more interested in like just what's going on between the subject, the audience, the single kind of member of the audience, the viewer, the watcher, the passerby. What's going on up here in terms of how images, even if they're images about cultural values, like how they're hitting and how they're working. And so he's sort of doing this dance where he's going between visuals and verbals, right? So visuals are images, verbals are words. So you're sort of thinking about the difference between visuality and like writing. Because again, he's drawing on verbal concepts in rhetoric that have to do with language and arguing and reasoning and so on. So that's why he's kind of splitting it down the middle here. But it's true, right? Like, I'm sure you've read something, maybe a poem or maybe a short story or some fiction or maybe even an essay, a nonfiction essay or something like that, and it just really lit you up, like the way it was written, the way it was crafted. I'm a big fan of the magazine The New Yorker. I feel like they have some of the best writing you can find anywhere, and some of these writers are just so good, and they're able to kind of like pop your imagination with just their descriptions, right? That to me is good writing, and so you don't have to only go in the direction of visuals when you're thinking about this kind of idea of presence and vividness, but images. And you can have really technical, boring, dry images, right? So it's not like it's images versus words. It's more about, as we will see later on, it's more about the vivid conveying of information, and that as all a form of presence. So first of all, this business of presence. I'm pretty sure I've talked about presence in class in the first module when we were looking at the argumentation stuff. This idea of presence is, Perelman gives a little example in the book about this sort of Chinese fable of a political leader, like an emperor, who's having a banquet or something and sees that there's some like ox that's about to be killed for the banquet and says, let's not kill the ox, let's kill a cow or something. And when asked why, he said, because I can't see the cow, I can see the ox, I've already seen it, I don't want to kill it, right? So there's something about the making present of the ox that makes it real and makes it present, right? Makes it sort of persuades you to realize what you're doing, and so he wants that distance so that he can like eat the animal guilt-free, right? So this idea of making something present, making it alive to the consciousness, this is really the ultimate goal of rhetoric, whether it's words or images, right? Is to try to make something pop in the imagination. So presence is, again, this concept that's coming from Perelman. I'm going like this because it's going back about 70 years or so. And it's a good concept, but it's one that Perelman used to talk about like argumentation, right? Like making arguments, and you're trying to select things in such a way that you're making the most potent and present kind of case possible. Nevertheless, he wants to use presence as a way to talk about the power of images. So I've got some notes here on presence. It's an important concept. Make sure you're good with it. This idea of attention. Now, he doesn't talk too much about attention, and attention is going to be something that we're going to talk more and more about, as the social media era really kicks in. But you can also think about like presence and attention. What is it that gets our attention is that which we feel is present, right? They sort of like two sides of the same coin. We attend to that which is present, right? And something is present when we attend to it. So it's almost like this, right? So those concepts go together pretty well. So how do you get attention, right? It's like, how do images grab attention by making something present? I note on the fourth number here on the notes, this business of, it's just a little kind of a side discussion about this idea of images as being proof, right? I think we're maybe a little bit more jaded, savvy, cynical about editing images and filters, and there's all of this stuff on social media about like social media is not real life, and we've been all kind of coaching ourselves to be like doubtful and suspicious of images. But, maybe back 20 years ago, there was a little bit more faith, there was a little bit more stability in terms of like when we encounter images. We are not necessarily of the immediate mindset that it's probably fake, it's probably been edited, it's probably been manipulated, it might be AI, who knows, right? This is before all that. So there was a certain sense of like, to see it is to believe it, right? If an image is really affecting you, then that moves you into a place of belief pretty automatically, just because it has that vivid, present, attention-grabbing kind of power, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Yeah, the stuff on vividness kicks in on 31. I've noted here to make sure that you really pay attention to that page. Again, vividness or vivacity is a concept that goes back to George Campbell's philosophy of rhetoric, Scottish theorist in the 18th century, one of the biggest works on rhetorical theory of that time period. And he talks a lot about what's going on up here in the mind, and he says basically the job of the rhetor is to make things vivid, vivacities, to make them pop, to awaken the imagination. Those modern guys had this idea that like, we have all these different faculties. We got like the imagination, which is like the playroom of the mind. But then there's this other faculty of reason somewhere, and it's like the gears working very efficiently, right? And so the idea was like the imagination, you want to awaken the imagination because it kind of guides reason or something like this. But anyway, vividness, vivacity, sharpness, aliveness. Sharpness is one of the best ways, right? Like it's very defined, it's very clean, it's very powerful and potent, vivid, sharp. I think my TV has a function, you can change the styles on it, and vivid's one of the functions, and it just makes everything really bright and sharp, and it's just sort of like, whoa, right? So that's the idea here. And so Hill says, whether it's verbal or imagistic, vividness, vivid information is more likely to land with an audience and move them, right? So the more likely, the more vivid the information, the more likely it is that the information will prompt an emotional response in the receiver. And then on 32, there's this great line that starts out, vividness, emotional response, and persuasion have all been shown to correlate with one another. Right, where you find persuasion, you find emotional kind of movements. You feel like an opening up, a kind of impact, right? And vividness feeds into that. So these things really work together. Vividness, emotionality, and persuasion. Now, again, I don't want to belabor this point, but when this volume was being written, the discussion of images was very new in rhetoric, and there was this almost controversial aspect to like, oh, you're studying images. That's not rhetoric. Why? Because it's not rational. Right? The idea that images are non-rational, they're emotional, that disqualifies it as being rhetorical, because at the time, again, coming out of the middle part of the 20th century, still even into, the early part of the 20th century, there was this kind of lingering bias toward rhetoric as reason, as argumentation, as the rational processing of information and so on. And so it was a bit of a leap to be thinking about the emotional stuff, the non-rational, right? And so for a long time, well, at the time it seemed like a long time, there was a lot of discussion about like, how do we understand images persuasively but non-rationally, right? Like, oh my goodness, they're working on us, they're clearly having an impact rhetorically, but they're not rational. So what are we supposed to do? Right? Well, I think we've moved on beyond that quite a bit. And basically where Hill lands in this chapter is he talks about these two cognitive processing styles, two types of cognitive processing, number 7. I've talked about these in class a little bit. This idea of the quick brain and the slow brain. The analytic brain, as I think I gave the example in class of like, if you're just walking around out there, in the world, you're going to see cars all over the place, and you don't necessarily think about them too much, except if they're maybe going to about to bump into you. You got to be careful crossing the street and all that. But all that stuff is what he's calling heuristic. It's quick. It's architecture that's already in there, right? Like knowing how to kind of respond without even really thinking about it. But then the analytic brain is the more like, oh, now I need to buy a car. It's time for me to buy a new car. This is where my interests kick in. This is where things like cost and all kinds of considerations about safety kick in. And so now you're obsessively thinking about cars. You're analyzing the information. You're thinking about all the possibilities. And when you're out there in the world seeing cars, you're looking at them all and you're like, there's another one, the one that I'm interested in. You start seeing them everywhere, right? It becomes salient, it becomes present because your interests are there. And so the final point that he's making is that images basically appeal to that quick brain, right? That quick, efficient, reactive brain. This is virality, memes, all that kind of stuff. And so the idea is that they have a pretty potent persuasive impact, more so than a slow, long, drawn-out kind of explanation or reasoned argument. So that's the easy come part, right? The persuasion comes easy, but it goes easy. So it doesn't necessarily last that long unless the image is really, really potent and really kind of burrows in, right? So I guess the idea here is if you want to persuade, you always want to be thinking about this kind of balancing of like emotion, vividness, with also good substantive like information that helps extend out the thinking and shores it up and all that. He doesn't get too much into like prescriptions there at the end. He talks a little bit about emotions and culture and whatnot. But basically like images convey values, cultural values, personal values, all kinds of stuff. So we don't need to make hard distinctions between like evolutionary biological appeals versus cultural social appeals. A lot of the stuff we care about in culture is still pretty basic stuff. Safety, connection, solidarity, defense, communion, all these kinds of things. These do matter. But again, interest. Interest, I think, is still a big part of what is it that makes us respond or not respond. So there you go. I think that's probably okay. Again, this is a reading that we're looking at in a module on rhetoric as symbolic action. So we're thinking about the kind of the symbolic action of images and how we respond to them and a little bit of how they work on us and how we work with images. So not just words, but you can think about images using a lot of the same concepts that we use for thinking about words, right? And we will continue to look at the evolution of rhetoric. This is already jumping ahead kind of from where we were with Burke in the middle to late part of the 20th century. Now we're into the 21st here, but just in the barely first part of it. So you can see the transition from sort of the argumentation stuff more into the symbolic, visual, cultural kind of stuff, and that's where we're going to keep going. So hope this all works for you. Hope it makes sense. If not, come reach out and we'll chat. All right? Peace.